First of all, I'd like to thank everybody for having me today. Specifically, I would like to thank the Global Center for Women in Justice for having me here today to speak about this. I have been a special agent conducting criminal investigations for 23 years now. It's hard to believe it's gone that far this quick. And in that time, I've spent 18 years conducting investigations against crimes against exploitation. The vast majority of those have been exploitation of children. And in that capacity, most of it has been from online exploitation of children that blurs into our physical world. And I will talk about that shortly. I'm a father of two amazing children. A 7, soon-to-be 8-year-old boy, and a 13, soon-to-be 14-year-old girl. And I will tell you that these kids are so amazing that I've likely learned more from them than they have learned from me, especially when it comes to dealing with kids and going through puberty and understanding what I've seen and watching them develop to the point where I am now seeing the things that I have talked about and have investigated for a long time and watching those challenges that my children are now going through. To that end, this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, and I very much appreciate Global Center for Women in Justice for what they do in reaching out to educators and people who are trying to solve this problem and end it. I often say that if I never had to do another investigation and I lost my job as a result of stopping this problem, that would be the greatest achievement. But the fact of the matter is that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen anytime soon. So we need to stay in the fight, and we need to stay motivated, and we need to work together. This is a multifaceted problem. It is not something that we are going to arrest our way out of in law enforcement. It is going to take education. It's going to take training our parents and our caregivers and our children and law enforcement and other support networks to make sure that we are doing what we can to minimize and hopefully someday eradicate this. My discussion today is about being hard targets. This is something that's kind of come up organically. I'll start out with a quick story. About 14 years ago, when I was relatively new, maybe not new, 4 years into conducting child exploitation investigations, I ran into a particular case of a 13-year-old girl who had been manipulated online. And she had been tricked into sharing private pictures with somebody she thought she loved online, whom she had never met in person. This particular case, unfortunately, was commonplace and still is today. The predator in this case was an individual who was in Argentina. That predator had maintained multiple personas online, to include one that she fell in love with. But not just that, he maintained personas online that harassed her and bullied her. That way, he was able to become her white knight and develop that trust with her and sort of build that relationship. Once the inappropriate pictures were sent, he began to blackmail her. And as this story has been told over and over again, gets bad. Fortunately for us and for her and for her family, she eventually disclosed the abuse. That's when I was called in as a law enforcement officer. Now, I tell you this story not because it's unique, but I tell you this story mostly because this was a turning point for me as an investigator and for me as an adult. Because about 2 weeks into this story, into this investigation, I finally decided that it was time to interview her two best friends who had also been moving in the same social circles as the predator, who was pretending to be from that area in Massachusetts, but was really an Argentinian. And she gave me the name of the first person, her best friend, lived 2 doors down, and a phone number. And when I asked for her second best friend, she gave me a phone number with a Michigan area code. I was confused because she was 13 years old and she lived in Western Massachusetts. I asked her if that person lived around here. She said no. I then asked her, have you ever met this person before? And she said no. As you can imagine, I immediately thought perhaps this was just another persona for the predator. Turns out I was wrong. this was actually another 13-year-old girl from Minnesota or Michigan, who she in fact was very good friends with, somebody that she had met online. And what was interesting to me is even though I had many, many years of law enforcement experience in that time, it never even dawned on me that perhaps these two best friends of hers, one she had never met in person. And the realization there was to me was that she literally thought different than I do. At my generation, the Generation X, we did not grow up with technology. Our brains did not develop the exact same way. She is at the point where she can develop a relationship and emotion and communication over online and digital communications in a way that I'm really incapable. My brain would not let me become as close to a person whom I've never met in person as perhaps her brain would. It would always be sort of this distance on it. And that was a real wake-up call for me as an investigator, because I needed to start to realize now that the reason these kids are so easily manipulated is because they see digital media different than we, my generation specifically, saw digital media. I needed to think about that boyfriend online, not through the lens of an online relationship, but I needed to think about it through the lens of that same 13-year-old relationship I would have had in junior high. And I remember that time, right? I remember the amount of pressure that I brought on the apple of my eye, if you will, when I was 14 years old and in 8th grade. And every day I would go home and I would do my homework and I would do my chores and I would get on my BMX bike and I would ride 1.5 miles to her house before her parents got home and just sit on her front stoop and pay her just a tremendous amount of attention. But after that 1.5 hours, I went home. And if I wanted to talk to her, I had to pick up a phone in my kitchen and chat with her, which I did, by the way, a lot. Having said that, though, not everything was permanently recorded online. That pressure wasn't 24/7. But this young woman who was being assaulted through various internet accounts operated by the same person was under a 24-hour assault. And she was under a 24-hour assault and being comforted by somebody who she saw as her real-life boyfriend, and in her mind there was no difference from it. And from there, we approached that investigation a little bit different. Now that was quite some time ago. I'm happy to report we did identify the individual, and that person was arrested in Argentina, and she's doing well now. But from there on out, I started to look a little different. So I started thinking about how do we make our kids hard targets? How do we view the world different than they view the world? And hard target came from that particular interaction. I actually had the vice principal of that that junior high at that point ask me to speak to 900 children, which by the way was intimidating to say the least. And I sat there and I spoke to them. I started to ask myself, well, what do we do as parents, as caregivers, and as trusted adults to make our children hard targets in the physical world? And we do it. We do it intuitively. For all of you in the room, the very first time maybe you got on a busy subway with your mother, and she said, hey, you need to take your purse off your shoulder and put your purse over your head and kind of slide it in front of you. She was teaching you intuitively to make yourself a harder target for somebody who would otherwise steal your purse. And for every father or mother who said, hey, take your wallet out of your back pocket on the subway and put it in your front pocket, they were intuitively teaching you how to become a hard target. How do I, as a kid who grew up and came of age in the 80s, teach my daughter, who was under 24-hour bombardment, how to become a hard target? Unlike the previous generations, I did not experience what she is experiencing. My brain did not develop in the same way that her brain developed. So I need to learn this skill set as an adult and figure out how do I give the skills necessary to my children and to the people around them. And that's what we'll talk about today. First, I'll say a little bit about the technology. This, by the way, is bad news. Most of my speech, unfortunately, is bad news. And the reason that it's bad news is because the technology is so good. It is very good indeed. So good, in fact, that as a criminal investigator, somebody whose job it is primarily to de-anonymize bad actors online, whether they be hackers or they be terrorists or they be those who prey against children, produce child sexual abuse material, distribute it, and receive it. The technology is good. And the reason the technology is good is because it's not some hacker wearing a hoodie that we see on television with their head down in front of a keyboard. No, this technology is being developed by some of the best cryptologists, mathematicians, and computer scientists in the world. For example, I'll start with the quote-unquote dark web. And hopefully you'll bear with me here just for a minute. I'm going to try and share my screen and see if we can do a live demonstration. But the dark web itself, most of you have heard of it. The dark web is thought of to be this ominous place filled with markets where people trade in child sexual abuse material, and they trade your credit card numbers, and they move arms such as weapons and explosive materials. And the dark web is a place where darknet marketplaces sell drugs, any kind of drug you want. And I will tell you that's true. All of that is true. It's very easy to get on. And the scary part isn't necessarily that is true. The scary part is how easy it is to access those marketplaces and kind of access that technology. And the real boom in technology has been not necessarily that the tech has gotten better, but it's more so that the tech has gotten easier to use. I'll give you an example. Maybe a decade ago, a little bit less, Apple decided that it wanted to move its text messages from green to blue. You guys might remember this. It went from green standard text messages to what's called iMessage. And one day they just did the update and they pushed it out. It was in the wake of the Edward Snowden leaks where the US had been accused of reading text messages and copying them for most of the world. Now, I can't confirm that what Edward Snowden leaked was true, but I can tell you that it had a rippling effect throughout the world and throughout the world of privacy. And as a result of that, companies like Apple decided they were going to go to end-to-end encryption. And if you let your phone auto-update, one day you had unencrypted text messages, and the very next day you automatically had encrypted messages. You didn't have to do anything. There was no bar for entry. You didn't have to download an app. You didn't have to insert a PKI key, encryption key to make it happen, or passwords. Essentially, Apple created all of that for you in the back end, and it switched it all over to you. And it switched it immediately over to you. And that's what we saw happen in late 2010 or 11 with Tor, or what is known as the dark web. And I'll go ahead and I'll attempt to share my screen right now and see if this works. Great. Hopefully everybody can see that screen. That is not actually what I wanted to show you. So here we have a regular web browser. This is Firefox. And when you go to a website like Tor, right? And this is, you can pick any website that does this, but basically these websites are looking for what's called fingerprints related to your computer. And it tells you little things about the computer. Like you guys can see here that I am in Northern Virginia right now. You can see what my IP address is. You can see that my internet service is Verizon. If you roll down, you can start to pull other information from my computer. You can see that my operating system is running at least in OS Windows 10. You can see these are my keyboard configurations that I have language set for US. You can see here I am in Northern Virginia, pretty close. I live right around the corner from Falls Church. You can see my time zone. You can see my screen size, which is pretty interesting, right? And all of this exists, by the way. Your computer presents all of this stuff so that you can get a smoother experience when you're online. But this data that's collected just by visiting a website is used to fingerprint your computer. And so basically any website that you go to visit, whether you're logged in or not, can create a unique fingerprint. You have like a 1 in 275,000 chance of looking just like somebody else online. Well, when we start talking about Tor and we start talking about the Onion router, we have to look at where it came from. And I mentioned that the Onion Router Tor came from smart cryptologists. It was actually the US government that built it, specifically the Navy. As I was in the Coast Guard, I like to give the Navy a really hard time about that. But at the end, Tor was created by the government to create anonymous communications, and then it was later adopted and co-opted by these criminal organizations to sell drugs and trade in child sexual abuse material. So if I open up that exact same web page, by the way, I can also visit, I cannot see the top of my screen. If I visit torproject.org, visit torproject.org, you get to see a website that's very similar to any other one you'd see. And basically, it advertises, hey, we're blocking trackers, we defense against surveillance. By the way, that browser fingerprinting that Google or Facebook or any other commercial company is doing is what they're pushing themselves against. Like, as if Tor is the good guy, right? This is the dark web. They're a 501c3 tax time's coming up. You could donate to the Tor project if you wanted to. And really, if you wanted to use this Tor browser, you would just hit download browser, install it like you would Firefox or Google Chrome or anything else, and you would be rocking and rolling. You would just use it at that point. So I'm going to open up the Tor browser now so you can kind of see the difference and how easy it is. Here's the exact same website, but now we're looking at it, navigating through the Tor browser. And what you'll notice is that none of the JavaScript, none of the screen size, none of the language, the language is still set for the US, but Tor is basically just designed to make you look anonymous online, to look like everybody else who's using Tor. And if you were to click this little button up here, it might be really hard for you guys to see there. Instead of knowing what IP address I'm coming from, what you're seeing is that I'm leaving my location here in Virginia. I'm traveling to a Tor node in Germany through another Tor node that's also located in Germany, and I'm getting an exit node. My IP address is coming from Romania. Now, if I was to visit Google, for example, at this point, and it won't work now because I have JavaScript turned off, you would see that I was coming from Romania, and Google would give me the Romanian splash page for Google. And I'm completely anonymous just by downloading it. And without getting into the specifics of how to get to these darknet marketplaces, that's a discussion for another time. I'm happy to engage if you're necessarily interested. What I really want you to take away from this is how easy the technology is to use. So, if the technology is this good, if the text messaging, the apps, the iMessage, Snapchat, which by the way, is essentially designed to delete pictures and delete fingerprints and to delete history, and to keep things anonymous and not let it preserved is a good idea. And there's nothing that we can really do about that, so what do we do? Because we can't beat the technology. At this point, we need to start looking at how people use that technology. And so, to that end, we have a couple of options. One, we could just tell our kids they can't use the internet until they're 28, which actually would make me feel much better. Unfortunately, this is not our best option. First of all, it's not impossible, right? As soon as they leave the house, they're going to leave. And I've struggled with this myself. When my daughter went into 7th grade, I had to think to myself, hey, do I allow my daughter to get on Snapchat, which is clearly marketed towards teens and to her age chat? But I also know that it automatically deletes, and even with the parental controls, I can see who she's speaking to, but I can't necessarily see what she's saying in any way, shape, or form. Do I let her get on there, or do I keep her away from it? And that's not an easy question, and I think that answer changes from one situation to another situation when you deal with it. And I'll discuss what my decision point on that was here in just a minute. But what I like to lean into and what I like to start to talk to my child about is understanding how predators work, because this this making our kids hard targets is the best options that we have. Look, if you know that somebody is going to pickpocket you, and you trust your instincts while you're walking down a busy street, and you just decide to cross that street and avoid it altogether because you saw the problem, you avoided the problem altogether, that's always the best case scenario. And that's certainly what we want the children in our lives to do, and we want them to do it in this online environment. In the cyber world, we have two different types of virus detection. We have what's called definitions. This is probably something you've seen a bunch. Hey, your virus definitions are out of date. We have to download the latest stuff. And the way that works is it looks at the exact signature of that virus, and if that file is present on your computer identifies it and it deletes it. It knows what the problem is and it gets rid of it. But then there's another type of virus software. It's called heuristic virus software. And what that does is it looks for the behavior that viruses generally engage in. And when it gets that behavior and it sees that behavior, it quarantines it. It keeps it from doing damage elsewhere. And this is what we need to look for. Now, we've all done this in the past. When I first came on as a special agent in 2002, by the way, this is before the Department of Homeland Security even existed, I was a special agent with the U.S. Customs Service. And one of the big things that was happening in 2002 was the Nigerian print scams, right? And there were these customs scams where people had just won a tremendous amount of money overseas, and if you gave them $5,000, they would give you $20,000, right? Because they just needed to pay the customs duties. Or that Nigerian prince wanted to marry you online. And we've seen a million versions of these things about come from them, right? And we're seeing them get even worse now with the deployment of AI into these scams. But in 2002, I dealt with these scams. Now, it's almost laughable now if somebody was to call you and say, hey, I'm a Nigerian prince. If you give me this money, $5,000 now, I'll give you $20,000 later. And that scam is not a thing that we necessarily see anymore, that narrative, because it was used for so long, it almost seems laughable that anybody would fall for it. But in reality, when it was novel, it wasn't laughable. And a lot of people did fall for it. And a lot of elderly people lost their entire life savings based on those scams. And so what we look for is, okay, let's look for the behavior of that scam. What are the hallmarks of it? And we see it today with the IRS scams, right? They call you, you owe them money, send them money, and there's a million different versions of these that we work on. And so let's start looking at the behavior that predators use while they're online. I mentioned they use multiple personas to develop trust. They exploit direct messaging and encrypted apps and anonymous platforms. If you download, whether it's Signal or Telegram, iMessage, chats within games, they are there, right? These predators, and I'm going to continue to refer to them as predators because that's what they are, will identify and be where their prey is. And if their prey is children, if children is what they are looking for, they're going to be in the spaces of children. Games and game exploitation is something that we're seeing more and more of and growing at an exponential level. So what do these predators do, and what can we talk to our children about? Well, they typically follow a standard grooming model. I mentioned earlier today that we are talking about the blending of the physical world and protecting our kids and making them hard targets in the physical world as well as the online world. And mostly that's because we want to keep the physical world and the online world are joining together. And we can't look at it as two separate things anymore because the children's brains are developing in such a way that they see those two things as the same place. And they communicate, whether they're communicating via text message or voice or in person, they are communicating and having the same emotional reaction from those. So predators will typically look for and select their victims. They will try and find them. And once they do find them, the first thing they're going to do is look for an opening to gain access. The hard part about this is it's no different than making friends online, somebody you're gaming with. For every 98 people you meet online who are decent people who are looking for the same thing you are, engaged in the same game you are, there are those 2% of the people who are not. There's the 2 who are posing as somebody who's looking to engage in the game, but in reality, they're predators. And through this, they'll start to develop trust. And again, predators developing trust is no different than friendships developing trust. Where the grooming process goes sideways is when they start to desensitize the child. After they build that trust, they will work on isolation. They will work on getting that child, whether it's online or in the physical presence, removed from the people that they trust, or breaking down the trust relationships between, say, for example, a child and a parent, right, or other friends who are highlighting maybe the dangers of this particular relationship. And then they will start to desensitize the child. This is where we see the unsolicited pictures of pornography, or they start talking about things that would not be normal. And they gauge that reception. And from there, they start to normalize that abnormal behavior. And then from there, they go to maintain control. And once they invest that control and that trust, our kids become very, very vulnerable at this point. And the bad news here is that these guys are very, very good at it. So we train our children. We teach them to look out for it. We teach them to look for abnormal behavior. I had an opportunity recently to talk with my daughter about this. She, along with 4 of her other friends, walked about a mile. And I live in an area in Northern Virginia that's quite safe. It's quite nice. It's the type of place anywhere in America you would say, hey, this is the place you want to be. And for one of her friend's birthday, her friend was turning 13 years old, so it was a group of girls, 12 and 13 at the time. The mom said, hey, I'll get all your backpacks, put them in the car, you guys walk 1.5 miles to the local coffee shop, and you guys can all get yourself pink drinks. These sweet drinks where they can feel like they're older and more mature while they sit around the coffee shop. And it made them feel great, and they really enjoyed it. And after that, my daughter told me a story. She said, hey, I got catcalled. She didn't know the word catcall, by the way, but she pointed out that 2 cars had driven by who had hollered at these 12 and 13-year-old girls, obviously men in both of those cars. And she didn't really think much of it, but I thought this might be a great opportunity for me to highlight the abnormal behavior. And so we did the math. We decided in an hour, based on how many cars we saw go down that street in a 5-minute span, we extrapolated it out to about 400 cars. And of those 400 cars that went down in the time, it's a very busy street, obviously, that went down in that time she was walking on that street, we decided that half of those cars were men and half were women. And of that half group of cars that were men and women, that leaves us 200 men. And she now was catcalled by 2 of those cars. So 1% of those cars exhibited what is definitely abnormal behavior. It is not the 80s, it's not the 70s. Catcalling 12-year-old girls from a car is abnormal behavior, and it needs to be seen as such. These people are telling on themselves. And I highlighted that for my daughter, and I pointed out that she didn't really know which car it was and who it was, and this was a good way to describe how online is with groups of people. When people start to express this abnormal behavior, we need to listen to them. I've heard it said on Reddit and television a bunch of times. When people tell on themselves, listen that they're telling on themselves. And so that's what we did. We looked for that, and we looked for that abnormal behavior. So, back to my question about do we keep our kids offline, and what I decided to do with Snapchat. When my daughter was 12 years old and she entered 7th grade, I decided that we were going to allow her to use Snapchat. And I will tell you that, coincidentally, I just happened to be having a meeting with the CIO and the CSO of Snapchat at that time. It was about work-related stuff. And I really understood Snapchat as an app as well as you can understand it, what the parental controls are, what the limitations of those parental controls are, what the risks are. And the reason that I elected to allow my daughter to download Snapchat was twofold. One, she really, really wanted it, and I have a hard time saying no to her. 2, and how I rationalize this to myself, is that I need her to develop the skill set of seeing this abnormal behavior now, while she's 12 years old and she's not exposed to really terrible things. If I wait until she's 14, 15, or 16, the kids at that age are engaged in much more aggressive behavior. And I just don't want her to go into that system without the skill set of understanding and seeing and being exposed to the technology, to the safeguards, what her options were in that technology. And it's also a lot easier to look at a 12-year-old's phone every day than it is a 15-year-old's phone. And so I figured, let's exploit that now and let's have conversations. I'm sure that if my daughter was here now, she would tell you that I talk too much and that I lecture and chat with her far too often. But at the same time, I think she would just say that because she understands it and she hears it so often from me. So my advice to parents is to look, and I will attempt to share my screen here again, is to start looking at technology and the technology that your kids are using. I also am of the mindset that if we teach our kids how to see the bad and we make them hard targets and we have open and honest communication with them, it would be great. Look, it is a non-stop discussion or decision point between parents and their children to decide where they are safe and what are those balances and lines. Like, as a parent, I want my little girl or my little boy to grow up feeling that the world is safe and secure and their childhood was happy and that they never had a thing to worry about. And they had those secure connections with me and my wife and our family. But at the same time, I don't want to send my daughter out into the world ill-prepared to deal with what she's going to have to deal with when she's 18 years old, without those safety nets and without that skill set. So to that end, it is my suggestion that we start looking at strengthening our kids online, right? And we start that from a relatively early age. We have open and honest discussions. We seize opportunities to talk to those children. We discuss that internet safety with children at all ages and engage on that online activity. I think that you need to monitor your children online. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean the same thing for every parent. What one kid might do and how one family might work might be different from what another family will do. Keep devices in a common room. Understand that I engage in a contract with my daughter, essentially that, hey, I will let you have Snapchat, but at any time I choose to look at it, whether you're mid-conversation, whether it's at night, whenever I want to look at your phone, you're going to have to surrender it to me without pushback. That, by the way, worked for about 3 months, and then it started pushing back. But we've reestablished those ground rules, and she's continuing to engage in that. I think that we need to explain to our children that the images that are posted online are forever, right? I think children are smart. They understand the dynamics of what happens, but anything that they do online is going to exist forever. That online footprint. For example, my daughter recently was at a soccer training camp, and they asked if she would do a bunch of drills so that they could put it on their Instagram page, right? Which was very flattering to her. And that's okay, as long as she's comfortable with understanding that those pictures are going to exist online forever. And that's a hard decision to make as a 13-year-old. And largely, I have taken that off of her plate and not allowed her to be posted online ever. Actually, if she wants to be a spy at some point in life, she could totally do it because she's got no online footprint, though she is resisting me on a regular basis. In addition to that, I think you need to check your children's profiles on a regular basis. What are they posting online? Who are they talking to? Ask them what every name is. Are the people that they're chatting with people that they know in person? Which person is it? And challenge that. They, as I mentioned, will not see a difference between somebody they only know online versus somebody they only know in person. And if they've met somebody only online, what is the nature of that? And then following through with that. And then privacy settings. I can't stress this particular part enough. When we start talking about privacy settings, we are talking about, especially when the children are younger, setting those boundaries for the kids. Because what ends up happening is the children often are leaking or giving away more information than they realize that they're giving away at any given time. So they can easily be tricked because a spear phishing campaign where somebody knows a bunch of information specifically about you is something that they'll use to gain your trust. I know you, we have this mutual friend, here's why I know all these things about you. When in reality, the child just didn't realize that those settings and that all those details were available to them online. And in addition to that, using parental controls when it comes to all of those settings. I'm going to be the first to admit that parental controls is not the most friendly piece. Every app is a little bit different. Every app does something different. For example, Facebook's Kid Messenger piece, I started to figure that out. No sooner did I figure it out and start to get comfortable with it that my daughter was no longer using that technology because it changes quickly and it's not cool. Apparently that's just for boomers, she told me. In that vein, though, I've had to continue to learn other ones. And truthfully, I've got to the point where I have the settings on. I actually bought her a nicer phone than I probably otherwise would have, just because I wanted to use the settings and the privacy settings built into the Apple iPhone, because I found them a little easier to use because that's what I use personally. But understanding that and taking the time to dig into it and working through those settings with them is important, right? Just as important as setting screen time for younger kids. My 8-year-old, for example, already Roblox is an online video game where he is now, it never even dawned on me when he was 5 years old to turn off chatting because he didn't know how to read or write well and didn't chat. But now that he's going to be 8 years old, it almost slipped my mind that I needed to engage with that because he was now starting to get friend requests on that. And that was a terrifying feeling, even from my point of view. So from here, let's talk about empowering them to be hard targets. There's a lot of mindset when it comes to dealing with children. And again, I'm blurring the physical world with the online world here, because I think that we need to really start looking at it through the same lens when it comes to children and the way they view them both. But we need to know and remind our children that it is not their job to make people feel comfortable. If somebody is uncomfortable or they are uncomfortable in a situation, they don't need to be afraid to be rude and to pull themselves out of that situation, even if it is. Especially with the young women of our lives and in our world and our society, we too often tell them that they need to make everybody feel comfortable around them. Whether we say these exact words or not is irrelevant because that's the feeling they get, that they have to be happy, they have to be smile, they have to be polite. And truthfully, this is just the wrong answer. And so we need to empower our children to take control of situations like that. When they feel uncomfortable, there might be a reason for that. We need to embrace the technology advances that are coming in. And when you're getting those technology advances, you need to look through them and you need to bring them in and know that the threats are real and that the solutions are diving in headfirst and raising our own cyber IQ. We need to lean into the technology and not be intimidated by the technology. Worst case scenario is you just mess it up and then you just start over again. That's the upside to it. And safety isn't just about blocking your threats, it's about teaching the kids to see those threats as they're coming. Now, before I go on, and if there's any opportunity for questions, I'm happy to take them or see them online. I have a caveat to everything that I just told you. And it's a huge caveat. And this caveat is about shame. I have spent the last 15 years speaking and educating smaller groups, not in situations like this. It's more of a one-on-one with classrooms and schools for the most part, and talking about kids being hard targets and how they can take control of their bodies and they can take control of their mindsets, and that these kids can prevent these bad acts. But truthfully, what I've realized over the last couple of years is that that's not entirely true. Sometimes bad things happen to good people. These predators are very good. And in the end, when somebody is assaulted or they are taken advantage of, it is not the child's fault. It is the fault of that trusted adult. It is the fault of that predator. But here's the risk we run as parents, especially me coming as the special agent who's worked on this stuff for so long, is that I tell my daughter, you are strong, you are independent, you can make these decisions, you can see the problems coming. But if something does happen, if a trusted adult does take advantage of her, if she does fall victim to one of these things, what have I just told her? Have I told her that she didn't say no well enough? Have I told her that this is her fault, that this happened because she didn't follow my advice? She didn't do the things her dad told her to do, who cared so much and he felt so strongly about. And he was so passionate in telling me over and over again and seizing every opportunity that I could to remind her how to look for these predators and to make her be safe. No, none of this is her fault. But you can see how I laid that foundation, how I laid the foundation for her to feel ashamed that it happened, even though that was never my intention. My intention was to make her strong and independent, but I laid that shame. And as that happens, now does she disclose to me? She was tricked by somebody, this is not real, but if she was hypothetically tricked by somebody online to send an inappropriate photo, will she tell me? Or will she be concerned that I'll be disappointed that she didn't follow my lessons? And that's the risk we run. And if she doesn't follow my lessons, if she doesn't disclose to me right away, you can see how it gets bad. We had a criminal investigation here in the DC AOR where we had a 16-year-old girl who was tricked online. 16. Unfortunately, that's a story that happens a lot, but she felt that shame, and she didn't tell anybody, and she was blackmailed into sending more pictures over and over again. And this went on for 8 more years. It wasn't until she was 24 years old that her boyfriend at 24 finally found out about this and helped her, found out about this, engaged her mother, and they finally disclosed to law enforcement. And I will point out that once she disclosed to law enforcement, we were able to find it, but it was not her fault, right? There was no shame in what she did or how she was taken advantage of. But that shame was there, so she didn't disclose. As soon as she did, we were able to stop it. So that's the caveat I give to you. When you talk to your children about being hard targets and about seeing the predators and about leaning into the threats and identifying them ahead of time, you also need to talk about the bad things that happen to good people, even though they don't deserve it. You need to let them know that if it happens, they need to reach out. And again, this is very close to home for me, but my daughter 2 weeks ago told me she felt uncomfortable with one of her trainers. And she asked if she didn't have to go back again. And truthfully, I kept my cool with her, which I'm surprised I did, because I will tell you I felt homicidal rage at that moment. And truthfully, nothing has happened, right, that I'm aware of. And we talked about the shame, but really it hit home, and I was really pleased with her being able to tell me that. But I reiterated and I went through essentially what I just told you now. And it's that particular incident that made me put it on as a caveat to the end of this speech. So with that, I want to thank everybody for joining. I want to thank the Global Center for Women in Justice. I want to thank Dr. Morgan for having the opportunity to discuss and to chat with you and to talk about this ubiquitous problem that we're all attempting to fight and we're all attempting to deal with together. Lastly, I would leave you with using resources and some of the resources that you have available to you. DHS, for example, has a Know to Protect project and iGuardian, right? And you can Google these or find. Department of Justice Project Safe Childhood uses the Department of Justice, and it uses the U.S. attorneys who engage in that stuff to talk to children, right? Same with the iGuardian. You have the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's Net Smarts program. For teachers and parents and children of different age groups, they have it broken up, and I found that to be a wonderful resource and a great way to start conversations with kids or groups of kids. And so please use that. Use your law enforcement connections if necessary, and let's fight this together as a team. Thank you very much.
Okay, this is your turn now. We have another 10 or 12 minutes with Special Agent Chris Diorio. Let's give him another big hand. We've got questions for you, Chris. Are you still there? All right. All right. So how many of you have entered a question on Slido?
Oh, let me pull that up. I had it up on another screen.
Okay, so he's got Slido. He's going to start answering your questions. While he's pulling that up, one of the first questions from the first session that somebody posted is kind of a rhetorical question, but I want us to carry it through this whole day. Will you walk shoulder to shoulder with me? And I love that. And if the answer for you is yes, please raise your hand. All right, great. And in 12 minutes, we're going to get a break. And don't forget, restrooms are over here. But let's stay focused now. Chris, have you seen the questions? Do you want to start answering?
Yes, I am looking at these questions right now. So it's a bunch of the questions. Is there a way to connect more with the special agent? Yes, so that Project iGuardian program, and maybe I can put that in the chat, or I can follow up with you, Dr. Morgan, on some of those links of the places that I mentioned, that the Department of Homeland Security's Know to Protect is KNOW, the number 2, Protect, is an HSI-run initiative by the Department of Homeland Security. And through that, you can request through your local HSI office, outreach programs to connect with investigators in your area from it.
And here's a question. When a website asks to accept all cookies, is that considered dark web?
No. So cookies are an interesting thing about the internet, right? So cookies we think of as a bad thing for the most part because they track you and they know what you're doing online and they allow websites to see what you're doing from one place to another. But in reality, cookies are the things that allow you to have a great experience on the website as well. So for example, if you were shopping on your favorite online vendor and you go away from the computer, you come back, those items that stayed in your shopping bag or your shopping cart before checkout, those are all cookies that are tracking that. Cookies are tracking what your screen size is, whether you're on a mobile phone or you're on a computer, and it's giving you the correct website. The problem isn't the cookies themselves. The problem is the persistence of cookies on your computers and them not being cleared or being loaded on. And then what we've seen is that companies have now started to use cookies to track your behavior across multiple websites. So regardless, for example, if I log into, I have a great example of being tracked by a company. So I have no Facebook account, but Facebook knows everything about me. So how does that work? Well, what happens is, anytime I've ever gone to a web page, you've ever seen that little F at the bottom of any screen, and it doesn't matter which one you visit, but there's F, there's a Google, there's a YouTube, there's maybe a TikTok reference. Every time you visit one of those, they are tracking your computer, right? Or they're putting cookies on at that point. And when you go to another website, so for example, if I'm trying to find tents and I want to, because I'm going to go camping with my kids and I'm doing research over multiple websites, those cookies are tracking and they're going to figure out that I am looking for tents. And what ends up happening is when I go maybe the next day and I'm trying to find a wedding gift for my cousin and I go look for the top 10 best wedding gifts for this year, all of a sudden the advertisement on that is for tents. Well, how did it know that I was looking for tents? Is it listening to me? But what ends up happening is really those Facebook things are tracking, and that advertisement on that blog, even though it doesn't say Facebook, is actually a Facebook advertisement, right? And I'm just giving you one example. Every company does it. It's not just Facebook and Meta. And so that's what cookies do, and that's what the risk is. So I think it's very important to understand is what is your exposure online? What information are you giving away? And understand that at some point, you're going to have to give some away if you want to use the services that are given to you online. A very good mentor of mine once said, if it's online and it's free, you're the product, because they're collecting your data.
See, so my idea of staying away from cookies in my kitchen is probably a good idea in life. Here's a really important question, Chris. How do I talk to my parents? So I'm assuming this is a young adult. How do I talk to my parents about me getting catcalled, harassed, without them getting mad at me and losing trust about going out, even if I didn't do anything wrong?
Yes, unfortunately, this is all too common, right? We have parents from different generations that don't necessarily understand, or maybe from different backgrounds that don't understand what the kids are going through today. And that's one of the reasons that I'm up here talking today, but I might offer my parents some of those resources online and looking towards some of the challenges that kids are facing. There are a number of different places where maybe you can help educate your parents or talk to them or explain to them that you feel uncomfortable. Without knowing your specific situation, I will say that finding trusted adults in your life, especially if you're a young person, is very useful. In spite of the fact that my 13-year-old tells me she knows everything, we all know that she doesn't know it all yet. And really where it becomes most dangerous is not knowing what you don't know, right? That you don't even know that you don't know what's about to happen. And I know that sounds like a bit of a tongue twister, but I think that trying to educate them is going to be your best bet because you're definitely going to need them in your corner.
Okay, another big question here is how do you deal with a child who has already been communicating with a predator? My first answer was just no.
Yeah, so if they've already been communicating with a predator, it's about talking to it. And I have done with investigations like this as well, where I have known predators, and I cannot actually get the victim to realize that they are a victim in this particular place, right? And that's a really difficult position to be, especially as a criminal investigator, where that's not my primary role. I have been asked to come in, and this has been in trafficking cases on a regular basis, where young girls, unfortunately, and young boys have been brought in and trafficked by people that they think love them, and that's not the case. And the parents have asked us to intervene and see if we can go kind of a scared straight type piece on it. And I'm always happy to help the parents any chance I get on any investigation that I'm working, but I can tell you that that's a particularly hard thing to deal with. Now, if they're already communicating with a predator, disclosing to your local law enforcement can be very useful at that particular point because they will see it, especially if it's a known online monitor or something that we're already looking into. And then helping with those reports online and to your local police and the federal police level will help deal with them. And again, at HSI, this is an agency-wide issue. We are a victim-first agency. Every criminal investigation we do is focused on identifying, rescuing, and assisting victims. And catching the bad guys, while very important to us, is secondary to helping the victims. What we have found is if we focus on rescuing and identifying victims, the bad guys we find en route to, and we're able to just push it on, or able to engage that way. And I think that focusing on the actual child is the focus there versus the predator.
Love that answer. Have you seen a difference with how Gen X versus the younger generations of parents approach parenting in the digital age?
Obviously, any experiences that I've had on this are very much going to be anecdotal, but I have seen that some of the younger parents, right, where I'm like I said, squarely Gen X, some of the younger millennials who grew up with text messaging are faster to understand the technology and to engage with it. One of the things I've also noticed, though, is that the millennials seem to trust the technology a little bit more than the Gen Xers and the older generation, just because they grew up with it, and if they didn't have necessarily a negative experience themselves, they don't see it as the potential threat that maybe some of the older generation does. And I think kind of leveling the expectations and talking about what the actual threat is important. I'm very big on not overinflating what the problem is. I tell my daughter all the time, the 1%, the 2% is what we're looking for, and how do we find that wolf in sheep's clothing or wolf in a sheepdog's clothing, right? Looking out like they're gonna protect you. And understanding that the world isn't bad. Not everybody in the world is bad, but there are definitely bad people in the world.
Are QR codes trackable?
So a QR code can be made to be trackable. Essentially, when you scan a QR code, what you're doing is you're pulling information down that's been condensed into a computer language, right? Everything on computers is zeros and ones, and that's what a QR code does. So you can actually hide code in a QR. So, for example, if I take a QR code with a phone that's offline, but it has the ability to look at it, it's not going to track anybody. But what ends up happening is when you track a QR code, say for example, you go to your favorite restaurant, you scan that QR code to get access to the menu, for example, that could be spoofed, for example, where it says, okay, here's a QR code, and it sends you to a malicious website first, but only for a second, not a second, a millisecond. You never even see the threatening website, and then it forwards you on to the menu or the place you were trying to get to. So it's not necessarily that the QR codes are trackable, it's what the person has programmed the QR code to do once your electronic devices scan it is the threat.
There are so many great questions here. Last one we have time for, how are we using these tools to protect children who are immigrant status?
I'm not sure I necessarily understand the question. You mean like
Looking at kids that are here, they don't have documents. I know one of our panels, we're going to talk about homeless youth and kids with special marginalization issues. So I think this is probably something iGuardian's workshop tomorrow will talk about as well.
Yes, I think that's right. And I can touch on it briefly because marginalized children, whether it's socioeconomic, immigrant status, homeless status, these groups of people are indeed at the highest risk of exploitation, right? They are the ones that are the predators, the people who are grooming are going to look at the most. And unfortunately, they're also the ones usually who have the least amount of access to some of the resources necessary to make themselves hard targets and use those tools. And I think that as a society, we owe it to them to educate them, to provide them, because even though they may be homeless or they come from a broken socioeconomic area, we've still seen that they have access to the internet, to phones, whether that's schools providing electronic devices to them because it's necessary for their education. So it's very important for us as a community and as law enforcement and as caregivers to make sure that we do everything we can to focus on them because they may not necessarily get that information without us finding them and reaching out and educating them.
Chris, you're amazing. I know we'll continue this conversation. Can we show our appreciation? I don't know if he can hear, but I'm turning the mic.